Hey everyone. I get a lot of questions about painterly portraits, and outside of using a program that's dedicated to that type of thing like Corel Painter or Topaz Impression, which is part of the Topaz Studio collection, both of which are, well, not both of which. I have a Topaz class over in the membership area, and I'm planning on doing a Corel Painter one as well in the future here shortly. But those are really rather not, well, Corel is definitely expensive, and the plugins like Topaz, which can stand alone, are awesome, but they're another thing. And so I get the question a lot, how can I do something like this in Photoshop? And I actually think you can do a lot of it in Lightroom, but it's easier in Photoshop because you can work with layers. So let me show you how I do kind of a painterly rendition of this picture over in Photoshop, but mostly using Lightroom filters. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is just open this up in Photoshop. So I'm just going to double click and let it open. Okay, so now I'm going to just clear off some of the clutter. And the first thing I want to do is duplicate the layer. So Command or Control J, like that. And now on the separate layer, I'm going to work with what I'm going to call my painterly sort of effects. And first of all, I'm going to go to Filter and then Camera Raw Filter, which is essentially the Lightroom packaged as a layer. And I'm going to show you what I like to do for painterly looks. Now, there's a couple things that play into painterly, and the number one thing is lack of sharpness as we would consider a photograph. So when we look at her here and we zoom in, we see how sharp it is. We see every pore. We see each hair. We see all of that. And that's the nature of a really high quality photograph. It records a lot of detail. So with painterly effects, what we want to do is simplify, because most painting type pictures have fewer colors involved and they have fewer details involved. And so we really want to drill down to the essence of the picture minus all those details. And you might say, why on earth would I want to do that? Well, this is sort of what separates the people who are big into photography from the people who are big into painterly photography. The painterly photographer type people really are trying to simplify to a great extent, and people who love really sharp photography are just different. It's not that one is better than the other. It's just they're different. So if your personality fits in with one or the other, or maybe you go through periods, and I definitely do this. I tend to be painterly, and then I like super sharp. And this is one of my favorite lenses. I believe this is the 135 from Sony, the G Master, just ridiculously sharp and awesome. And yeah, it is. It's the 135 at f1.8. I mean, this, friends, is at 1.8. wide open, and it is just sharp. But let's go painterly with it. So first of all, what we want to do is deal with texture. And so I'm going to just take the texture slider all the way over. Immediately, that gives us more of a smooth, simple look. Now, I prefer that over clarity, which tends to be weird looking. You get this sort of halo-y, bizarre effect, which also saturates the color. It's bizarre. So I'm going to double click on the dropper there. The other thing that with painterly that you need is variations in tone. Okay, so when you're painting, you're using values, you're using highlights and midtones and blacks and shadows, which is what we all have here. It's just they're more separated because you're actually applying them with a paintbrush individually. So one of the things I like to do is up the clarity, which starts to separate those things out. Now, you notice right away that it looks really ashen. It takes away the color. See pretty pink lips, and now it starts to pull it out. But you also see how the highlights and the shadows start to come out as well. So we're not going to worry too much about the crispiness, because the next step is going to be going down to detail panel here, and with noise reduction. So noise reduction has color noise reduction, which we might want to pull over. You can be really aggressive with color noise reduction slider, because it's just going to pull out those speckly pink and teal and magenta type dots that you see from computer noise. Basically, it's static on the sensor. It's the sensor is saying, give me all the light. And the sensor starts to work a little bit, and you end up with some interference, some static, and that's what noise is. And we don't have a lot in this image, but cranking up that clarity slider all the way can really bring it in. So I tend to just, move that over to the right pretty aggressively. Then noise reduction, you usually want to be kind of careful with it, because not being careful enough with it can create things that look like this, which is a lot softer. And you might be saying, I don't want to do that. But if you're trying to go for a painterly effect, this is pretty brilliant. It softens it all. It takes away some of the crispiness from the clarity, which is opening up the details, separating the details. So if we go back here to the basic section, when we work with clarity, that's mid-tone contrast. That's the surfaces. So the surface of her skin, the surface of her dress, the surface of her hair. Contrast tends to work with the extremes, the brightest brights and the darkest darks. It separates them. Clarity does the same thing with the mid-tones or the middle part of the histogram. So maybe we want to move some contrast over a little bit, but usually it starts to clip the shadows and highlights too quickly. So I tend to avoid using contrast for that reason. Don't pay attention to the background. I'm not going to apply all of this that we're doing right now to the background. I'm just going to apply it to her. And so let's go with highlights, maybe a little bit. Maybe, I don't know, just a little zhuzh there. I'm looking at the histogram. I've got some space here, so I can just move this over. If I hit the edge, she starts to lose detail in her skin, which in this case, I don't want to happen. I don't want it to be blown out. But again, we're going for painterly, right? I can lower the exposure a little bit and then maybe push the highlights more. Oh, I like that. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. And now remember, when we use the clarity, it really made the colors go wonky. You see, now we've got pretty colors, and then as we push it, it gets more and more ashen. So then we're going to want to up the vibrance a little bit, perhaps. Return some of that color. There's two choices, vibrance and saturation. Saturation is global color. It's going to move every color up the scale. Vibrance attempts to protect skin tones, so we can use that. All right, so this is where we're going. Now, there are other things that we could do, but this is the main approach here: texture and clarity. Clarity all the way over, texture all the way down. We could play with things like dehaze, which can really amp things up. We can make it lighter and darker, but I don't think I want to use that this time. Let's see if there's anything else. We're really messing with clarity, or messing with the texture, I should say. So back down to details. Noise reduction. Now in the detail slider here with noise reduction, we can increase the effect. Let's zoom in here. All right, so this is going to, let's swing it both ways. This is off, or all the way to the left. Ooh, even more. So this is really smoothing everything out, and this is trying to preserve as much of the individual detail as we can. So by moving the detail panel, the detail slider over to the left, we get an even more kind of painterly effect. Basically blurry, if we're being honest here. So I click open or OK, which transfers this whole thing over to Photoshop. And we're going to be able to click it on and off to see the before and after, which we're not really done yet. Let's zoom in here. So this is before. I'm just moving my microphone a little bit. And after. Okay. So now that that's on there, we can adjust the opacity, or we can put a layer mask on there. And if I grab my brush tool by hitting the B key, and make it a little smaller, and then I can go up here and maybe make it 50%, so it's not removing all of it. I can start to remove it right over her irises, kind of restore more detail there. I don't know if I want to take it off of her lips as much. Like that. And then the last thing that you can do is remove it in areas that you don't want it. So I don't really, well, actually that's what I was doing, wasn't it? I just got ahead of myself. So let's go to 100%, and I can remove it off the backdrop if I want. But in this case, actually, it's not so bad, because I messed with lowering the exposure and upping the highlights, which sort of muted the background. So in this case, I'm just going to put it back. But what I am going to do is create a stamped layer, Command Option Shift E, grab my patch tool and start to get rid of some of the variegations in the background that might be attention grabbing, like that. Okay, so you could stop here, but it just looks blurry, right? We could do one more thing. So let's just make another layer, Command J. So we're just repeating that layer. I'm going to go up to Filter, Stylize, Oil Paint. And the settings that I like on this one are everything over all the way to the right, except the very last slider, which is lighting, and that's all the way to the left. This works better on images that are mid-range size, so maybe 4,000 pixels on the longest side. If you have an image that's 9,000 pixels on the longest side, this isn't going to show up as well. If you have an image that is 2,500 pixels on the longest side, it's going to be extreme. So it just depends. You can play with the stylization, the cleanness scale, and bristle detail, but this is sort of my default. Hit OK. And then turn it off and on, and then lower the opacity. I usually lower it to about 50%. And then I can add a layer mask, grab my brush tool again, decrease the size, make sure I have a black brush chosen, and remove it from her eyes. All right, so now this is a great preparatory image that can be exported out and then used in another program like Corel. Or you could use something that adds painterly type strokes on the iPad. Lots of different things like the out brush stroke, or there's an old one called Glaze, which is kind of not being updated, well, isn't being updated anymore. You could do something like Meta Brush, which is part of the iColorama family. There's lots of options, but this is a very painterly style that removes a lot of the detail, and really it's just mushing everything out. And we could go in here and mask things off. You could take it. Now remember, if I go ahead and group all of this, Command G after I've selected them, we can turn it all the way off and all the way on, and we could lower the opacity of this group. We could go ahead and add a layer mask and invert it, which makes it go away. And then we could paint with a white brush, paint the painterly effect on where we wanted it to. I can return it back to its painterly thing by hitting Command I again. So that is more of a painterly effect. And then if you're feeling even so inclined, you could go ahead and Command Option Shift E, create a stamp at the top of this stack, and then you could go ahead and use the mixer brush, which is, if I can remember now where it is, we will find the mixer brush tool up here. And the mixer brush has a lot of different options, and I suggest that you just start with the very wet heavy mix, 100%, load 50. It's on mine, it's the default. It may not be for yours. And then we want to not necessarily sample all layers because we just used the top layer, which we grouped, but make the brush really small. Let's zoom in, make it really small, and then we can start to kind of move this stuff around. So if there's something I want to paint over, if I want to smooth her hair, you can see it better here. You see where things are kind of, just sort of, where things are kind of messy. This kind of pulls it in. Like that. So here's where you can start to change it from feeling super photographic into feeling more painterly. This is better with like an art pen from Wacom or Wacom. Some people say it Wacom, but I think it's Wacom. And I have an art pen that I like to use for this. My son stole it. He's genuinely an artist who paints online or on the computer, so he stole it. But anyway, you can see that you can start to do some painterly effects with just the smudge tool, or sorry, not the smudge tool, the mixer brush tool right here, which looks like a little paintbrush with a drop of paint next to it. Anyway, you can go in and start to work with that if you want to continue the effect. But doing these preliminary steps in Lightroom give you a painterly foundation that gets you halfway there. And then if you do go in with a Wacom pen or a tablet and start to use the tool here, the mixer brush tool, it can just get you so much, it gets you there faster. You could start there with your photograph and do all the painting, but I feel like blurring it up and doing all of this and enhancing the contrast ahead of time gets you there so much quicker and makes the process a lot more enjoyable. All right, thanks everyone. Bye-bye.